In the summer of 1941, the ancient city of Riga stood at the edge of annihilation. For centuries, Latvia's capital had been a crossroads of cultures: Baltic, German, Jewish, Russian, its streets echoing with commerce, prayer, and civic life. That fragile balance collapsed with stunning speed after June 22, 1941, when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, its massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Within days, the German Wehrmacht swept into Latvia. What followed was not merely military occupation, but a calculated campaign of racial extermination. For Riga's Jewish population, numbering roughly 40,000 before the war, the arrival of German forces marked the beginning of a catastrophe that would erase an entire community within months. The Nazi killing machine did not operate alone. From the earliest days of occupation, it relied heavily on local collaborators, men who knew the streets, the neighborhoods, the families. In Latvia, one of the most notorious of these figures was Herbert Cukurs. Before the war, Cukurs was known nationally as an aviation hero, a charismatic pilot, an officer in the Latvian Air Force, and a celebrated figure in interwar Latvian society. He embodied modernity, daring, and national pride. But in 1941, that public image fractured irreparably. With the German invasion, Latvia's fragile independence vanished overnight. Soviet forces retreated, leaving behind chaos, fear, and resentment fueled by memories of Stalinist repression. The Nazis exploited this environment expertly, framing their war as a crusade against Bolshevism and Jews, two identities they deliberately fused into one enemy. For some Latvians, collaboration appeared as revenge, opportunity, or ideological alignment. For others, it became a descent into unimaginable brutality. Cukurs aligned himself quickly with the Araj Commando, a Latvian auxiliary police unit led by Viktoras Arņis, under the supervision of the German Einsatzgruppenmobile killing squads tasked with exterminating Jews, Roma, and political enemies. The Araj Commando became one of the most lethal collaborationist units in Eastern Europe. What distinguished Cukurs from many collaborators was not merely his membership, but his visibility. Survivor testimonies collected after the war in Latvia, Israel, and Germany repeatedly identify him by name. He was not a bureaucrat signing papers behind a desk. He was present at scenes of violence. He carried weapons. He gave orders. He acted with initiative and cruelty that left a lasting imprint on those who survived. By July 1941, mass arrests of Jews in Riga had begun. Jewish men were seized from their homes, workplaces, and streets under the pretext of security measures. They were beaten, humiliated, and often murdered in public. Families were torn apart within minutes. Mothers watched sons disappear down stairwells. Fathers were dragged into trucks, never to return. Cukurs was seen during these early roundups, often wearing civilian clothes or makeshift uniforms, armed and authoritative. Witnesses later described his voice confident, commanding, unrestrained by doubt. One of the earliest mass atrocities occurred with the burning of Riga's synagogues. The Great Choral Synagogue on Gogol Street became a sight of horror. Hundreds of Jews were forced inside. The building was set ablaze. Those who attempted to escape were shot. Multiple survivor accounts place Cukurs at the scene. Some recalled him laughing, others remembered him firing a pistol at windows. The details vary, but the conclusion does not. He was there and he participated. The violence escalated rapidly. Jewish homes were looted, women were raped. Elderly men were beaten to death in the streets. Children were murdered in front of their parents. These were not random acts of chaos, they were systematic, encouraged, and increasingly normalized. By August, the Nazi administration imposed yellow stars, curfews, and forced labor. Jews were compelled to clean streets, dig graves, and dismantle their own synagogues. Riga's Jewish population was being psychologically broken even before the largest killings began. Cukurs' reputation for cruelty spread quickly among the victims. Survivors recalled that his presence provoked particular terror. He was known to ride bicycles or vehicles through Jewish neighborhoods, armed and searching for targets. He abused women openly. he shot prisoners arbitrarily. He enjoyed the power he wielded. One survivor later testified that Cukurs murdered a Jewish woman by forcing her into a pit and shooting her while her child screamed nearby. Another described seeing him strike a baby against a wall. Such testimony, horrifying as it is, appears consistently across independent accounts gathered years apart. By late 1941, the Nazis implemented the next phase, total extermination. The Jews of Riga were forced into a sealed ghetto, overcrowded and starved. Disease spread rapidly, executions were frequent and public. Rumors circulated of mass shootings in forests outside the city. Those rumors were true. In November and December 1941, tens of thousands of Jews were marched from the Riga ghetto to the Rumbula forest, where they were stripped, lined up, and shot into pre-dug mass graves. These killings, among the largest single massacres of the Holocaust, were conducted with German oversight, but relied heavily on Latvian collaborators. While direct evidence of Cukurs at Rumbula remains debated among historians, his documented participation in earlier killings and ghetto violence places him squarely within the machinery that enabled the massacre. His role as an enforcer, intimidator, and killer helped ensure that resistance was crushed long before the final death marches began. By the end of 1941, Riga's Jewish civilization built over centuries was effectively destroyed. Synagogues were ashes, schools were silent. Homes were empty or occupied by strangers. Of the city's Jewish population, only a few thousand remained alive, most doomed to die later in camps or forced labor battalions. For the perpetrators, however, life continued. Cukurs remained free, armed, and influential. He was not punished. He was not restrained. The Nazi occupation rewarded loyalty and brutality, and he provided both in abundance. The war still raged across Europe, but for Riga's Jews, it was already over. The collapse of civil life in 1941 was not an accident of war. It was the result of ideology, opportunity, and individual choice. Herbert Cukurs chose his side. He chose violence. And the city of Riga would remember his name long after the gunfire faded. The guns of World War II fell silent in Europe by May 1945, but for the survivors of Nazi terror, the end of combat did not signal justice. In Latvia, the Jewish community was almost entirely annihilated, leaving behind empty streets, ruined homes, and memories too heavy to bear. Among the architects of this devastation, Herbert Cukurs was conspicuously absent from the lists of captured or prosecuted war criminals. Cukurs' freedom was neither accidental nor unique. In the chaotic months following Germany's defeat, millions of displaced persons wandered the ruins of Europe. Borders had shifted, governments were in flux, and the Cold War was already reshaping alliances. Many of those who had actively participated in Nazi atrocities exploited this confusion. Some assumed false identities, while others found refuge in sympathetic nations. Cukurs' path led him across continents. Initially, like many collaborators, he remained in Europe, moving through Germany and Austria. He leveraged contacts among former Nazis, military acquaintances, and anti-communist networks. These connections were critical. They provided falsified papers, safe houses, and travel assistance. By the late 1940s, he had secured passage to Brazil, a country whose government, intent on shielding itself from the communist threat, was broadly permissive toward European war criminals who could present themselves as harmless immigrants. Once in Brazil, Cukurs established a seemingly ordinary life. In Porto Alegre and later Rio de Janeiro, he rented boats, piloted small aircraft, and ran sightseeing tours. Locals often saw him as a distinguished pilot, a charming entrepreneur, even a patriotic Latvian exile. He maintained his physical presence in the public eye, yet the man who had presided over mass murder in Riga's streets and forests was now walking freely under the sun, untouched by courts or legal scrutiny. For nearly 2 decades, the juxtaposition was stark and bitterly ironic. Across Europe, survivors and governments debated statutes of limitation. Some politicians and legal theorists argued that time, fatigue, and political pragmatism to close the book on past crimes. Nazi hunting organizations like Simon Wiesenthal's efforts in Vienna and Israel pushed back fiercely, asserting that moral and legal responsibility did not expire with the calendar. Israel, newly founded in 1948, assumed a particularly resolute stance. The state had been born from the ashes of the Holocaust, and its leaders recognized that justice was not merely punitive but symbolic. For Israel, pursuing Nazi perpetrators even decades later was essential for honoring victims and ensuring that the horrors of the genocide could not be dismissed or forgotten. This conviction was institutionalized through the creation of Mossad's Special Operations Units, designed to track and neutralize war criminals who had evaded prosecution. During this period, Cukurs lived largely as a public figure. Photographs show him piloting planes, attending gatherings of expatriate Latvians, and interacting freely with Brazilian society. Unlike other fugitives who hid in the shadows, he remained brazenly visible. This visibility eventually became his undoing. Jewish communities in Brazil, though small, were vigilant. Survivors of the Holocaust had migrated worldwide and often recognized the faces of perpetrators. They began collecting photographs, documenting the identities and activities of known collaborators who had escaped justice. Through a network of information channels stretching from South America to Europe and Israel, intelligence agencies gradually received reports of Cukurs' presence. Meanwhile, the psychological impact on survivors remained profound. Families of victims had witnessed the destruction of Riga's Jewish community, and many knew that individuals like Cukurs had been directly responsible for the deaths of their relatives. Letters, memoirs, and testimony collected in the 1950s and early 1960s frequently referenced his name, often describing him with the epithet Hangman of Riga. For these survivors, Cukurs' unpunished life in Brazil was a continuing injustice, a reminder that the world had failed to act decisively after the war. Cukurs' activities also posed practical challenges for the international pursuit of justice. Brazil's legal system lacked both the mechanisms and the political will to extradite him. Unlike European nations that participated in the Nuremberg trials or post-war denazification programs, Brazil's government prioritized stability and anti-communist alignment over prosecuting foreign nationals for crimes committed on another continent. Consequently, Cukurs effectively operated with immunity, despite being widely known to intelligence agencies monitoring Nazi fugitives. By the early 1960s, the window of opportunity for conventional legal prosecution had narrowed. Witnesses aged, evidence decayed, governments cited practical constraints. Yet Israel's approach remained uncompromising. Its leaders understood that the symbolic value of bringing a high-profile perpetrator to justice could not be overstated. The issue was not merely about Cukurs' crimes in Latvia, but about reinforcing a principle that the Holocaust could not be ignored, erased, or forgotten. It was against this backdrop that Israel began covertly preparing for one of its most daring and morally complex operations. The objective was clear: locate Herbert Cukurs in Brazil and ensure that he faced consequences for his crimes. However, conventional methods arrest, extradition, trial were deemed unlikely to succeed. Brazilian authorities were unlikely to cooperate, and international legal avenues were cumbersome and uncertain. The strategic and ethical calculus of Israel's intelligence community led to an extraordinary decision: the mission would be extrajudicial. The target would not be taken to trial. There would be no courtroom drama. The aim was to deliver accountability directly, decisively, and symbolically. This decision reflected both the limitations of the post-war legal environment and the enduring moral urgency felt by Holocaust survivors now operating within the Mossad. At the same time, the mission was highly personal. Mossad operatives were often themselves survivors, or the children of survivors, deeply connected to the history they were confronting. For them, the operation was not merely a state directive, but a personal imperative of reckoning with the traumas endured by their families, communities, and themselves. The psychological weight of such a task cannot be overstated. The operative would confront a man who had committed mass murder and remained unrepentant, isolated in a foreign country where discovery could be fatal. Thus, Herbert Cukurs' life in Brazil was a study in contrasts. He moved freely, engaging in leisure activities and public events, seemingly untouched by the gravity of his past. Yet behind this calm exterior, intelligence agencies tracked him. Survivor networks cataloged his appearance and habits. Photographs circulated and names were verified. Each day in the sun, each flight over the countryside, brought him closer to the reckoning that decades of impunity had postponed but could not ultimately prevent. In the shadow of these preparations, the moral dimensions of the mission began to crystallize. Could justice be enacted decades after the fact, outside legal structures? Was execution the only viable form of accountability for someone whose crimes had defied ordinary legal response? These questions were not abstract. They would define the character of the operative chosen for the mission, shape the planning, and ultimately determine the manner in which the Hangman of Riga would confront the consequences of his life's deeds. By 1964, the stage was set. Herbert Cukurs, long a visible figure of impunity in Brazil, remained unaware that the pursuit of justice was closing in. From Israel, a small, meticulously organized team prepared a plan that would combine intelligence, subterfuge, and courage in equal measure. Time had allowed Cukurs to evade conventional prosecution, but it could not shield him indefinitely from those determined to ensure that the horrors of Riga were neither forgotten nor unpunished. In this period of quiet tension, the historical lesson was clear: the end of a war does not always signal the end of accountability. For some, the war extends into decades, carried forward by the memory of victims, the persistence of survivors, and the uncompromising pursuit of justice by nations unwilling to forget. Herbert Cukurs' life in Brazil exemplified this tragic and morally fraught interlude, bridging the collapse of civil life in Riga with the imminent reckoning that would soon follow. By 1964, nearly 2 decades had passed since the streets of Riga had run with blood, yet the memory of the atrocities remained vivid among survivors and within Israel's intelligence community. In that year, a photograph taken by members of the Jewish community in Brazil crystallized what many had long feared but could not confirm: Herbert Cukurs, the Hangman of Riga, was alive, active, and living openly in South America. The image, unremarkable at first glance, showing Cukurs beside a small aircraft, smiling, casually sent ripples through the Mossad and other agencies dedicated to tracking Nazi fugitives. It was proof that the past, horrific and unresolved, had not yet been confronted. The revelation was more than intelligence, it was a summons. For Israel, Cukurs represented both a personal and national symbol of unfinished justice. Unlike bureaucrats who had hidden behind offices or legal frameworks, he had personally inflicted death and terror, acting with direct brutality. His impunity challenged the moral authority of the post-Holocaust world and the principle that crimes against humanity could not be erased by time or distance. Planning the response required precision, secrecy, and cold calculation. Mossad's leadership understood that conventional legal channels would fail. Brazil's government, protective of its sovereignty and cautious about political entanglements, would not facilitate extradition. The kidnapping operation, well considered, carried immense risk. The more audacious option of targeted execution was deemed the only viable method to achieve justice. This was not undertaken lightly. The mission involved ethical, legal, and operational complexities that could not be ignored, yet the urgency of delivering accountability outweighed all hesitation. The operative chosen for the mission was a Holocaust survivor. His parents had been murdered in Nazi concentration camps. He was, in every sense, a living embodiment of the horrors Cukurs had wrought. His selection was both practical and symbolic. He had the skills, the emotional resolve, and the personal motivation to carry out a task that demanded courage under extreme isolation. To the world, he would be a foreign businessman. To Cukurs, he would appear as a sympathetic expatriate with shared political leanings and an interest in aviation. Training was intense. The operative learned Brazilian Portuguese, studied Cukurs' public movements, and memorized details of his background, lifestyle, and social circles. He practiced improvisation, hand-to-hand combat, and methods of subterfuge designed to ensure survival in the event of discovery. Psychological preparation was equally critical. He had to navigate the duality of persona and purpose, presenting warmth and camaraderie to the target while harboring lethal intent. In preparation, Mossad officers scoured information from multiple sources, former collaborators' records in Europe, detailing Cukurs' wartime actions, survivor testimonies, providing context on his behavior, personality, and appearance, Brazilian civil records, confirming his residence, travel, and social interactions, photographic evidence, enabling precise identification and operational planning. The operative assumed the identity of an Austrian businessman and former Nazi sympathizer, a persona carefully crafted to appeal to Cukurs' ego and personal inclinations. This cover allowed him to engage Cukurs socially and gain proximity without arousing suspicion. The deception was complex. Small errors could result in exposure, arrest, or death. Once in Brazil, the operative began a meticulous campaign of observation. He traced Cukurs' daily routines, morning flights, visits to local aviation clubs, interactions with expatriate Latvians, and public appearances at small social gatherings. Every gesture, every conversation was noted. Slowly, trust was cultivated. Cukurs, accustomed to admiration and unaccustomed to caution, saw in the operative a kindred spirit, someone who respected his aviation skills, who shared nostalgic sentiments about Europe, who posed no immediate threat. As the relationship developed, Mossad's planners monitored communications and movements remotely, ready to intervene if circumstances changed. The operation demanded patience. Any misstep could result in the target fleeing, public scandal, or the operative's death. Yet the emotional and psychological toll on the operative was immense. Every conversation with Cukurs, every gesture of camaraderie, reminded him of the lives lost in Riga, of the screams of women and children, of the burning synagogues. These memories fueled resolve, but also carried a heavy personal burden. The final phase of the operation involved strategic positioning. The operative arranged meetings under the guise of discussing aviation projects and business opportunities. Cukurs, pleased by attention and validation, often responded with openness and candidness, inadvertently revealing patterns and vulnerabilities. Intelligence officers in Israel observed from afar, timing the moment when intervention would be most effective and secure. Ultimately, the mission's climax was not merely physical, it was symbolic. The operative confronted the man who had escaped justice for decades, who had lived freely while victims' families continued to mourn and rebuild shattered lives. In this confrontation, the purpose of the Mossad mission became clear. This was not vengeance for its own sake. It was accountability carried out in the most unambiguous form possible, a moral declaration that crimes against humanity leave enduring consequences, regardless of borders or years elapsed. This operation, like many Mossad missions of the era, was cloaked in secrecy. Documents were classified, operations never publicly acknowledged for decades, and the details became known primarily through later testimonies, archival research, and investigative reporting. What is evident is that Israel viewed such missions as extensions of justice in a world where legal systems were often inadequate to address extraordinary crimes. For historians, the 1964 hunt for Herbert Cukurs represents a convergence of multiple threads. The persistence of post-war justice. The operation underscores how World War II's moral and legal ramifications did not end in 1945. The human dimension of intelligence work. The mission relied on individuals profoundly shaped by the Holocaust, whose actions were inseparable from personal history and collective memory. Ethical complexity. Israel's choice to conduct an extrajudicial execution raises questions about legality, morality, and necessity in the context of historical atrocity. The role of survivor networks. The intelligence that located Cukurs came largely from survivors and expatriate communities, highlighting the enduring agency of Holocaust victims decades after the war. By the end of 1964, the Hangman of Riga had been located, monitored, and approached. The stage was set for the final act of a story that had begun in the streets of Riga over 20 years earlier. The war, for those who had survived and those seeking justice, had never truly ended. Time had provided distance, but not forgiveness, opportunity, but not immunity, and for Cukurs, this fact would soon manifest with irreversible clarity. This chapter of history demonstrates that World War II was not only fought on battlefields, but also in the shadowed corridors of memory, surveillance, and moral responsibility. The pursuit of Herbert Cukurs illustrates the intersection of personal grief, national duty, and the intricate mechanics of intelligence submission defined as much by ethical conviction as by operational precision. The mission to confront Herbert Cukurs in Brazil was more than an operational assignment. It was the manifestation of decades of unfinished justice. As the Mossad operative closed in, the story revealed its deeper truth. World War II, for many, did not end in 1945. For survivors, families, and those charged with pursuing accountability, the war had extended into memory, moral reckoning, and clandestine action. Cukurs, the Hangman of Riga, had lived in sunlight for nearly 20 years. In the quiet streets and small airfields of Brazil, he had cultivated a persona of normalcy. He flew planes, engaged with expatriate Latvians, and maintained a veneer of harmless civility. Yet, beneath that exterior lay the weight of crimes that could not be undone: murders of infants, women, and the elderly, ghetto massacres, and the systematic destruction of an entire community. Each day of freedom had only deepened the historical injustice. The Mossad operative, assuming the identity of an Austrian businessman and former sympathizer, had spent weeks, months, even gaining the trust of his target. Cukurs, unaware of the lethal intent behind the warmth and camaraderie, allowed the operative access to his routines, his habits, and his inner circle. Trust had been earned, but the cost was invisible to Cukurs. The operative bore the knowledge of every atrocity he had witnessed or survived, carrying it silently like a private ledger of grief. From the perspective of Israel and the operative, the mission carried multiple layers of significance. On one level, it was tactical: locate, isolate, and neutralize a fugitive guilty of heinous crimes. On another, it was symbolic: to demonstrate that even decades later, even across continents, justice could reach those who believed themselves untouchable. And on a third, it was profoundly personal. The operative, a survivor, carried the memories of a family destroyed by the very man he was hunting. The act of hunting a fugitive in a foreign land was inherently dangerous. Brazil's landscape was vast, communications were decentralized, and discovery could result in diplomatic incidents, imprisonment, or death. Mossad had prepared meticulously, but all operations carry the unpredictable human element. A sudden encounter, a suspicious gesture, or the smallest misstep could compromise the mission. For the operative, every day among friends and acquaintances of Cukurs was a tense balancing act between authenticity and concealment, empathy and lethal resolve. As the mission unfolded, it became clear that the operation was about far more than one man's death. Cukurs was a symbol, a representation of all those who had escaped the post-war tribunals, all the perpetrators who had walked freely while survivors lived with memory and trauma. By taking action against him, Israel was sending a message: time does not erase guilt, and distance does not confer forgiveness. The tension in these final days was both operational and ethical. Extrajudicial executions occupy a morally fraught space, challenging conventional frameworks of law and justice. Yet for Israel, the calculus was framed by historical necessity. The Holocaust had revealed that conventional institutions, when constrained by bureaucracy or political expedience, could fail catastrophically. When courts failed, memory endured, and moral obligation demanded action. The Mossad operative confronted Cukurs with the tools of trust and deception, entering spaces where surveillance was limited and appearances mattered more than substance. Social interactions, casual conversations, and displays of shared interest in aviation became the mechanisms of access. Each smile, each nod, each discussion was a carefully measured step toward final accountability. The mission culminated not in a public spectacle, but in quiet, decisive action. Cukurs' death was carried out in a manner consistent with Mossad protocols, precise, irreversible, and symbolically resonant. It was not about vengeance alone, it was about fulfilling a duty that legal and societal frameworks had left incomplete. In the eyes of survivors and the Israeli state, this act was a correction of historical neglect, an acknowledgement that some crimes demand extraordinary measures to uphold justice. The ramifications of the operation extended beyond the immediate act. It reinforced the enduring principle that the Holocaust and the atrocities of World War II were not temporal footnotes, but enduring moral realities. The operation also sent a broader signal to other fugitives who had believed that the passage of time or relocation could shield them from accountability. No corner of the world, no period of impunity could erase the consequences of mass murder and crimes against humanity. Historically, the hunt for Cukurs exemplifies several critical truths about the post-war period. Memory and justice are inseparable for survivors and states alike. Forgetting was not an option. Every photograph, testimony, and intelligence report was part of a moral ledger that demanded resolution. The war continued in shadowed spaces. While Europe rebuilt and nations formalized peace, individual and collective pursuits of justice persisted quietly, often in clandestine operations, far from the battlefields. State and individual responsibility intersected. Israel's decision to employ a survivor as operative reflects the intersection of national mandate and personal history, where moral obligation transcends conventional authority. Legacy of trauma shapes action. The operative personal connection to the Holocaust informs strategy, patience, and execution, demonstrating how history's human consequences influence real-world decisions decades later. For the world outside the intelligence community, the story of Cukurs' pursuit remained largely unknown for many years. Yet for those who documented the Holocaust, for historians tracing the web of Nazi collaborators, and for the families of victims, the operation served as a powerful reminder that the struggle for justice is not bound by time or geography. The principles at stake, accountability, memory, and moral obligation, are enduring, shaping policy, law, and conscience long after formal declarations of peace. Ultimately, the case of Herbert Cukurs, the Hangman of Riga, demonstrates that World War II's end in 1945 was not the conclusion for many who survived or for those who bore witness. The consequences of human cruelty, the failure of impunity, and the demands of justice persisted. Through the careful orchestration of intelligence, courage, and ethical resolve, Israel ensured that the arc of accountability extended to even the most elusive perpetrators. The war, in this sense, never truly ended. It continued quietly, relentlessly, in memory and in action. For survivors, for descendants, and for the operative who carried the moral weight of history into the streets of Brazil, the past was always present. The pursuit of justice did not erase grief, nor did it undo murder, but it affirmed the enduring principle that crimes of unimaginable scale demand recognition, reckoning, and, when necessary, decisive action. Cukurs' life and death, separated by decades of impunity and pursuit, remind us that history is not simply a record of events, but a continuum of responsibility. The acts of 1941 did not vanish. They persisted in memory, in moral obligation, and in the clandestine operations that sought to confront them. For those who lived through the Holocaust, and for the generations that followed, the narrative of the Hangman of Riga stands as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the unyielding pursuit of justice across time and distance. World War II, for the survivors and their inheritors, did not conclude with the signing of treaties or the cessation of battles. It endured in the shadow of human action and in the determination to ensure that evil, no matter how hidden, would not escape the reckoning that history demanded. The Hangman of Riga was found. The message was sent: accountability is relentless, Justice transcends borders, and memory preserves the truth even when the world hopes to forget.